Good evening. I'm Colonel Dave Gray. I'm the Executive Director here at the Center for Leadership and Ethics. I want to welcome you to the first Courageous Leaders speech for academic year 24-25. We're very pleased to bring you tonight's speaker, Mr. Benjamin Anthony, who is the first speaker on this series. Before I fully introduce Benjamin, I'd like Miss Rosita Penny, who is the Chief Operations Officer of Miriam, to stand and be recognized. Rosita, please stand. Now, we gear our Courageous Leaders speaker to our annual theme. Our center's annual theme for this academic year is about paradigm shifts. A paradigm shift is a fundamental change in basic concepts. Could happen to you personally, or it could be a large systematic change. Tonight, we're going to talk about both of those. And you're going to find that Benjamin's life story and his experiences on the international stage vividly illustrate this theme, as you're soon to learn during this moderated interview. Benjamin Anthony is the CEO and co-founder of the Miriam Institute, an organization that specializes in substantive policy-focused briefings on matters pertaining to Israel, the United States of America, and the relationship between these two countries, with a particular focus on the alliance between our militaries and their capabilities. Benjamin and Miriam have established a strong partnership. We think it's a mutual partnership, of course, with us over the past several years as VMI cadets have participated in Miriam Institute's Israel Strategy and Policy Program for the past 3 years. And we're going to do it again this summer. Benjamin is a combat veteran of service in the Israeli Defense Forces, having served during combat operations in Lebanon in 2008 and 2009, and just recently in Gaza. His military service informs many of his policy outlooks. Mr. Anthony is a regular commentator in the international media on matters related to Israel's security, and he provides frequent analysis on various international news networks. He has facilitated policy briefings to elected officials, including officials in U.S. presidential administrations, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, on those matters that deal with Israel and the strategic relationships and partnerships. Benjamin played an advisory role to the U.S. government on the Israeli-Palestine conflict and potential pathways to its resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Anthony Benjamin.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Colonel Gray, for those very kind words of welcome. Just a few acknowledgements, if I may. I want to give my profound thanks to Major General Wins, to Brigadier General Moreshi, to you, of course, again, Colonel Gray, and it absolutely is something I consider to be a mutual partnership and a mutual friendship that we've forged here. To your dear colleague, Sergeant Major Tom Sars, and also to my colleague, co-founder, and the power behind the Miriam Institute, Rosita Penny. It's wonderful to be here this evening in front of all of you. Before we come to the conversation, which I very much hope and anticipate will be a candid conversation, I want to make two very short statements. The first one is that, as you heard from Colonel Gray during the kind words of introduction, my name is Benjamin. I'm a retired sergeant in the Israel Defense Forces. I am a veteran of the Second Lebanon War of 2006, Operation Pillar of Defense of 2012, Operation Protective Edge of 2014, and I recently concluded my service inside the Gaza Strip, having come out of retirement in order to participate in Israel's war against Hamas. Through the work of the Miriam Institute, I have briefed members of the United States Congress, members of the United States Senate, and I've also briefed presidential administrations here in this great country. I make mention of those engagements because I want you to know, and here I address myself to the cadets, that the greatest honor that I have is having the occasion to address myself to you. And the reason for that is because I am alive today, literally, and I have a country to call home today, literally, as a direct consequence of the actions undertaken by people far closer to your age than to the age of your parents or your grandparents. I'm referring, of course, to the 18, 19, 20-year-old soldiers, the men and women of the Israel Defense Forces, who have laid down their lives and placed themselves in mortal danger so that I might know peace within the borders of our small country, the one and only Jewish state. The number who have laid down their lives since October 7th alone rests at 841 estimated. As a consequence of my knowledge of the members of the Israel Defense Forces who are at your age and stage, I know what people like you are capable of when you're focused, when you're motivated, and therefore I will be speaking this evening, as far as Colonel Gray permits me, with the uppermost candor, on eye level, and what I submit to you will be for your consideration, though not necessarily in the pursuit of consensus. Some of you may agree with that which I say, others may disagree. We're all fortunate to find ourselves in a country that allows such disagreement, safeguards it, cherishes it. The final thing that I want to say before I join Colonel Gray is this. We've seen the dereliction of the standards of international organizations that we were taught to look towards for moral clarity. And being raised as an Orthodox Jew, which I'll speak about in due course, when seeing the poor decisions of these international organizations with regard to the State of Israel since October 7th, I'm fortunate that I knew exactly, precisely, to where I ought to reach back in order to cling on to and cleave towards something of substance. And that is the good book and the commentary on the good book. And I say this to you, cadets, you future officers. There is a phrase in Judaism that comes from the teachings, the sages of our forefathers. And that phrase says the following. It says, quote, "Bamakom she'en anashim, hishtadel lihyot ish." In a place where there is no humanity, strive to be human. The soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces are in the midst of bringing humanity to a place that hitherto was ruled over by demons. You, in the course of your service, I don't know where or when, may find yourselves facing similar dilemmas. Regardless of how the media covers it, regardless of how the conversations by the water cooler take form, always be accountable to yourselves first and foremost. And if deployed to a place where you struggle to find humanity, strive always to be human. Thank you, and I look forward to learning from you by way of your questions.
So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight the format is a moderated interview. The way this will run is that I am going to begin the interview of Benjamin with 3 or 4 questions. I want to intersperse, though, your questions throughout the rest of the evening. So, as you can see, on both the left and the right of the stage, there are microphones. If you have a question that you're burning to share with us, and we want your burning questions, please get up quietly, move to the microphone, and wait for me to recognize you for those questions. Once I'm at a position where I'm accepting your questions, I'll take a few questions from each side, and then we'll continue on and we'll get as far as we can in the time allotted.
Yep.
Fair?
More than fair.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, Benjamin, it's been an honor getting to know you over the last 3 years, and you have a remarkable story. And we brought you here for many reasons, but tonight we want you to talk about paradigm shifts. And the first paradigm shift I'd like you to talk about is a personal one. So you were raised in Manchester, England, and you and your brothers attended yeshiva about an hour away from your home, had to ride a train. And really, your significant paradigm shift, individual paradigm shift, occurred one day outside that yeshiva. So could you tell us a little bit about your journey, not just to the yeshiva that day and the paradigm shift, but how that affected then the trajectory of your life after that?
Yeah. So first of all, again, thank you, Colonel. It's wonderful to be with you. It's lamentable to me that the light is in our eyes because I can't see your faces. But please know I consider it really a high privilege to be able to speak to you today. You're close with your question.
Okay.
I was born in the city of Leeds. In the northeast, and I was raised in the city of Leeds in the northeast, and I was raised as a very Orthodox Jew. I'm no longer as Orthodox as once I was, but I'm a very, very proud Jew, at least as proud as I've ever been. And as the Colonel said, the nearest Jewish high school to that town was in the city of Manchester. So we would travel, myself and 3 of my siblings, my older brother Jonathan, and 2 younger brothers, Raphael and Michael. We would travel for 2.5 hours each way, 5 hours of commuting time per day, in order to be around other Jewish students during the course of my high school career. And I went to 12 schools growing up, by the way. Most of those I promptly left because I got into trouble. So this was one of the schools where I was relatively new. And on one particular morning in 1994, my brothers and I stepped off the train that brought us proximate to the school gates. The walk from that train station to the school gates was all of 3 or 4 minutes, and we noticed that we were being followed by 7 men who were flicking rocks towards us. They were taunting us for being Jewish. They identified us as Jewish because in England you wear a uniform, a formal school uniform. And the 4 of us, noticing that we were being pursued by these 7 men, took up a very defensive formation, as incidentally, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is typical for much of diaspora Jewry, because of their diminutive numbers and because of the history in Europe. The default response to aggression is oftentimes a defensive posture or an evasive posture. And so my brother Jonathan stood tall at the front. My 2 younger siblings stood behind him. I brought up the rear. We quickened our pace to try and place a gap between our pursuers and us, but the gap didn't widen, it narrowed. And then suddenly the ringleader of this gang of 7 men launched an attack on my older brother Jonathan that was absolutely brutal. They headbutted Jonathan. He headbutted Jonathan. Jonathan was immediately rendered unconscious. I know that because I could see that his eyes had rolled back in his head, denoting the fact that he'd lost control of his faculties. One of the other gang members then held Jonathan up while others took it in turns to beat Jonathan. And as all of this went on, my brothers sought help in the neighborhood. None was forthcoming. I'm truncating the story. And ultimately, Jonathan was at a particular stage allowed to fall to the ground by this gang of thugs on the streets of Crampsall in Manchester. And his arrival on the concrete didn't mark the conclusion of the attack, but merely its intensification, because it was at that point, Colonel, that these thugs who had attacked him proximate to a building site, they proceeded to raise up bricks, stones, rocks, bottles. They threw them down upon Jonathan's head and upon his abdomen. They stomped upon him, they kicked him, they pivoted and jostled left and right in order to get at him. These 7 men actually got down on their knees so that they could be close enough to Jonathan in order to repeatedly pound his head into the sidewalk. And for far too long, as this assault continued, I stood by and I did nothing. And I did nothing, not because I was frozen by fear, but because I was suffering from two baseless presumptions. The first presumption was that these thugs would come to an understanding that enough was enough, and that nothing could be justified, nothing further could be justified. That didn't happen. And the second baseless presumption that I was operating from was that my brother was going to get up and turn this around, because he was my older brother, and when I would step out of line as a child, this was the brother who would swiftly bring me back in line. And it was only when I heard these thugs ordering one another not to stop until my brother was dead, that I threw myself over Jonathan. I was very badly beaten as well, in very similar fashion. I didn't lose consciousness. At the end of the attack, I stood up. I looked over at my brother. He was a bleeding and purpled mess to such a severe level that when my mother first saw him after the attack, she didn't immediately recognize him. I lifted my older brother up in my arms, carried him to the school gates, and I watched as an ambulance whisked him away to the nearest hospital. And as a consequence of that attack, Jonathan had to undergo 3 liver transplants in the space of 1 week. And in September 2020, Jonathan had to undergo a 4th liver transplant, the medical case for which I managed from afar. In the intervening years, he's married and he's become a father to 2 children, Maya and Asher. Has 1 daughter, 1 son. He's never known a day of good health since that moment, and that for me was a paradigm shift, because I can tell you not just I, but also Jonathan and my 2 siblings immediately ceased to know what it was to be a child. We were no longer children. We'd had a terrible, terrible interaction that all children should be spared from facing. And I also learned, and this actually escorted me in my military service and in my life decisions, not to be the 14-year-old version of myself who waited until it was appropriate to act, but waiting far too long to do so, to be quick to act, to be quick to assess, and to be quick to act in a very, very decisive manner. So that was the paradigm shift I believe you're referring to.
Yeah. Horrendous story. Probably the 5th time I've heard it. It never gets better. Brutal act of anti-Semitism and just outright thuggery and violence. So after that attack, how did that affect your feelings about staying in England, and how did that affect your decision to emigrate to Israel?
So I had always known, as far back as I can remember, that England wasn't the place for me. I had always known that England wasn't the place for me, and that goes back to when I was 4 or 5 years of age. As a young child, my father was a cantor in the community. He led the prayer services on the Sabbath in the synagogue on behalf of the congregation. My grandfather was the head of the rabbinic court in the town. And part of the Jewish identity, Colonel, was a strong sense of Zionism, a strong attachment to Israel. And that manifested itself during my very young childhood in us hosting veterans of Israel's war, Israeli veterans of Israel's wars, the 1967 Six-Day War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in our home over the Sabbath. And I remember that there were the Jewish men from my community. Those were doctors and lawyers and accountants and businessmen and everything else that you might associate with the Jewish community. And then there were these Israeli veterans who came over, and they were also doctors and lawyers and accountants and everything you might associate with the Jewish community, but they were in firefights and military campaigns, victorious military campaigns, against an enemy in this place that I'd heard about, never been to, called Israel. And as a young child, I thought to myself, there are Jews who do everything my father and his friends do, but they also fight and win. I want to be that kind of Jew. And so I'd always contemplated moving. The attack, however, really accelerated that desire. And at 18, I had initially volunteered to draft, to move to Israel and serve. Anyone of the Jewish faith can move to Israel just by virtue of their birthright. But I delayed it because my brother was desperately unwell, and I didn't want my mother to be concerned about a brother who was on death's door, quite frankly, not by choice, and another son who was running towards the fire entirely by choice. And I made a deal with myself, which was that I would go to university, and if the desire to move to Israel and serve in the military burned during that experience, I would directly go. And not only did it burn, it intensified. I faced virulent anti-Semitism on campus during university. I became a student campaigner for Israel at university. And we would meet Colonel and after our student campaigns to defend the name of Israel. And the student leadership would talk about how we have to go and fight and we have to go and serve and we need to do more. And none of them did, but I did. And the reason that I did was because I'd been raised by my parents to turn into a problem, towards a problem, and to act rather than speak. And so as the first opportunity I could, I went to Israel.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you to comment to inform our audience about the IDF.
Yeah.
But when you got there, you felt compelled, even though you're older than the average conscript and recruit, to serve in the IDF. So can you just, for our audience's sake, tell us a little bit about how Israel handles manning the IDF initially, and then talk about your service, because you go to war pretty quickly.
Yeah, I went to war pretty quickly, and I'm far from exceptional for that fact. And so folks, the Israel Defense Forces is really the embodiment of the realization of an open debate here in the United States of America, right? There's an open question in the United States of America about the polarization of society here. Can somebody on the left of the political spectrum, or philosophically on the left of the spectrum, engage with, work with, interact with somebody on the right of the political spectrum or the philosophical spectrum? And the answer seems to be perhaps not. This is the answer that's concerning people right now, that perhaps we're not going to be able to engage, in this case, as Americans. So one of the antidotes to that has been a live discussion, the proposed antidotes of what would be called national service. Not necessarily military, but some sort of civic engagement as a prerequisite along the lifespan of teenagers, essentially. In Israel, we mandate national service, and it's first and foremost through the military. So at the age of 18, unlike in the United States, unlike many of your peers in liberal arts universities around the US, at the age of 18, men are drafted into the IDF for a period of 3 years, approximately. It sometimes ebbs and flows, but it's usually about 3 years of conscripted service. Women are conscripted for 2 years, and the ultra-Orthodox, the very Orthodox, do not serve. There are some who are very observant, and they undertake national service without joining the military. But the bulk of Israel's youth is drafted into the Israel Defense Forces, and they are going to fight, and they are going to serve. About 11% of the total who are drafted are frontline combat soldiers. The rest are in vital auxiliary roles, and wherever one serves, they end up leaving with their connections, with their service well known. It's the first thing people are asked when they apply for a job. Where did you serve? In America, it's where did you go to college, I think, in most cases. And also having earned their stripes, and perhaps most importantly, having joined the generation of adults, because Israelis grow up with their fathers and their mothers talking about the wars in which they fought and where they served and what they sacrificed and what they lost and what they gained. So it's really a passage from childhood to adulthood, another paradigm shift, without which I think that Israel would struggle to be as cohesive as it's shown itself to be during this current war.
Okay, great. So you served in Lebanon. I want to kind of switch focus and jump forward here, because I know our audience will have some questions here. Having served in and fought against Hezbollah, just recently you raised your hand again and said, I'm willing to serve, and you went to Gaza. You've been on several programs to talk about your insights about Gaza and your experience there. Can you take us into Gaza through your eyes, and what do you see? And I have one follow-up question to that before I'll open the room up for other questions. But what did you see in Gaza during your recent service, and how does that affect your thinking about Israel and Palestine in general?
Yeah, so just a reminder to the audience, I said that I would speak candidly, but not in the pursuit of consensus. In Judaism, actually, we pride an intellectual tussle over consensus. Incidentally, it's the great rabbinic tradition. But in my view, Hamas is being fought today the way it ought to have been fought when it first launched massive attacks against Israel after Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip in 2005. I don't think that we should ever have allowed Hamas to arm up and entrench itself to the degree that it has been allowed to. And I viewed Gaza as a danger that was woefully underestimated by our policymakers over a period of several years. I felt that Israel, and then I'll come directly to my view of Gaza now, for your question, but I viewed our policymakers as being woefully misguided when they would emphasize, and some of you will have heard this, that first and foremost our resources must be channeled towards curbing Iran's nuclear weapons program and the threat of Iran becoming a nuclear armed state. And I disagreed with that because, and therefore the thinking went, Colonel, that all of our resources, the best of our resources, the best of our abilities should focus there, and we could leave the Gaza Strip and southern Lebanon where Hezbollah are on a low flame. And I completely disagree with that. First of all, I think leaders and statesmen have to be able, as the Americans say so elegantly, to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? You have to be able to do that. We don't have the luxury of selecting which theater we want to engage in. The theater is coming for us. And I felt also very, very strongly that it only made sense to do the opposite of what they were saying. They were saying tackle a distant threat and look away almost from a proximate threat. You need to do the opposite. You actually need to tackle a proximate threat, Hamas inside Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad inside Gaza, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and you need to defang them so that you have greater impunity when it comes to tackling the more distant threat, Iran. And so I could talk about that extensively, but just one more note about it because I think it's important for people to know. Hezbollah, as an example, in southern Lebanon, is there because Iran wanted it to be a deterrent against Israel hitting Iran's nuclear weapons program. That if Israel hit the program, Hezbollah would unleash 150,000 rockets, blanketing all of the state of Israel. I never agreed with that. I think that Israel needed to make a decision, which was, do we want to tackle Hezbollah in southern Lebanon when it's confined to conventional weapons, or do we want to have to tackle it when it's got a nuclear-armed patron? To me, it's a no-brainer. So with regard to Gaza, when the war broke out, I was at a stage in my career where I was told and almost believed that I could make more of a difference by being a commentator on TV because of my military experience, my experience lecturing and talking all over the United States. And I was appealed to do that, and I did it. But I didn't enjoy it. I felt I had another round of fighting and serving in me, even though I was 5 years retired. 5 years retired. They retire as young there. I was retired at age 39. And I knew that Israel was in the midst of a biblical scale war. And I knew that Israeli society was sacrificing. And I'm not really one for the media. I think the media has become utterly corrupt, mainstream media, utterly corrupted. It's not me echoing President Trump. I really would encourage everyone to view askance anything that they see in the media. And most importantly, I'd learned from my previous military service colonel that there is no substitute for a man in the field. And this is something I'd like you guys to keep in mind. You will be told, you will think about whether or not you should be serving in a particular role or another one. Some of those roles you want, others you won't. Always remember, go where you're needed, because only you can serve in the way that you will uniquely serve. Nobody else can do it the way you'll do it. So I felt that calling. I went back into the Gaza Strip. I served there for the duration, I was based there for the duration of my service, and I was along a particularly strategic area, which was the Netzarim corridor that bifurcates north from South Israel. It runs from the east coast, the eastern border of the Gaza Strip, all the way over to Jalot, which was the American base from which the Americans were seeking to establish an aid pier. I traveled that road, traversed that road dozens, many, many dozens of times. I saw the distraction inside the Gaza Strip. I am completely comfortable with the level of distraction in the Gaza Strip because as extensive as it is justified, it's required, and it's required because everything that was destroyed served as a nest and an apparatus and succor for terrorist activities there. That is what we were dealing with. It's a place with more than 400 miles of tunnels, deliberately designed to launch terror against the state of Israel. Those tunnels have their egress points in people's homes, in children's bedrooms. All of this was known, all of this is clear, and I think that we have to achieve the war aims. All three of them, we'll talk about that, I hope, but one of which is that Hamas cannot be allowed to constitute a threat to the state of Israel. In order to do that, it needs to be robbed of its infrastructure, and its infrastructure are the homes, hospitals, universities of the Gaza Strip. So the level of distraction is beyond my ability to describe, but I believe that as extensive as it is justified.
So, Benjamin, let me press you on this very point. There are many who would say, as they look at images on TV and look at the utter destruction, and for those cadets who traveled with us the last time to Israel, we actually got up to the security fence and looked inside Gaza. That no longer exists.
No.
The criticism is that the response, despite the tragedy, despite the atrocities that were committed against 1,200 Israeli innocent civilians, is disproportionate. That is not in carrying through with what our cadets learn about just war, being proportional, being discriminate, and of military necessity. It looks like perhaps the war has leveled the place. The Hamas healthcare system has reported 43,000 casualties, and I know those are disputed. But how do you respond to this idea that the response to this tragedy has been disproportionate?
Yeah, so firstly, I give very short shrift to any statistics coming out of Hamas's mouth. I don't care whether they refer to it as their medical authority. I don't care whether they refer to it as their foreign secretary. I'm really not interested, I'm afraid. Now I want to caveat this for all of you. You are granting audience graciously to somebody who's just come out of a war zone, who is, as I said earlier, far from exceptional for that fact, and who has seen horrors wrought against his people, the Jewish people, and some non-Jewish people, Israelis as well, the like of which I thought were consigned to the horrors of the Holocaust, which my grandfather escaped in advance of, but his sister perished by way of. So when you see those sorts of horrors, let me just be totally candid with you, you have to pick a side. Eventually you pick a side. And it may not surprise you, I'm on Team Israel. All the way. Okay? And therefore it matters not to me what Hamas has to say. It matters much more to me what Hamas did to us on that day. And it matters much more to me than that what we are going to do in order to prevent that from happening. So with that out of the way, let's talk about a couple of points. Firstly, before the Israeli Air Force or the IDF launched the ground incursion or the aerial bombardment on the Gaza Strip, there were, in my opinion, I believe the most extensive measures ever taken in the history of warfare in order to clear the population out of the area that was going to be operated in. Now, these include the dropping of leaflets from helicopters, from planes, in Arabic, showing where the residents of the Gaza Strip can move to along secure humanitarian corridors facilitated by members of the IDF, who, to be clear, can die in that service. Okay? Cell phones are called and texted to by the Israel Defense Forces to provide the very same instructions, cell phones of Gazans inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas seeks to prevent the Gazans from moving from the areas we're going to operate in to the humanitarian zones because Hamas views the killing of its civilians as one of its war aims, which may sound completely absurd to you, but let me tell you how we know that. Massive aerial bombardment, 400 miles of tunnels below ground, every single one of the civilians of the Gaza Strip could have found shelter inside the tunnels that Hamas built. None of them were permitted to do so. None of them were permitted to do so. Okay? So we make every effort to move them out of the areas where we fight. And if we really see that they are a recalcitrant population and they're not willing to move, we have a technique called knock on the roof. Are you familiar with knock on the roof technique? It's where a very light munition is deployed from an aircraft to knock the top of multi-story buildings in order to provide a very clear kinetic warning to the Gazans that we really are about to operate in that area, and this would be the moment for them to leave. I don't know of any other military that does anything like that. And in addition to that, we then send in the ground forces who provide a similar level of opportunity for the Gazans to leave where we plan to operate. And those ground forces in the modern battlefield, I have to tell you, are sent forward in no small part because they are the scalpel compared to the Air Force's broadsword. It's only the ground forces that can go house to house, window to window, door to door, engage with terrorists, spare innocents. And those ground forces are losing their limbs, their sight, their lives in the course of doing that. They are willing to do that because they are accountable to their own internal moral conscience. I'm very proud of the standards that we hold up. And if you want to step back and draw back the lens a little bit further, proportionality in warfare is not what most people perceive it to be. People perceive proportionality to be this number on one side was killed, therefore you're only allowed to kill the same number on the other side. That has nothing to do with proportionality. Proportionality in warfare is defined by the proportionate value of the target you are engaging when compared to the goal of the mission, operation, or war. That is proportionality. So when you have a clear 3 mission statements for this war, bring back the hostages, destroy Hamas as a functioning terror army, prevent Hamas from ever threatening Israel again, all of the targeting, in my estimation, is proportionate, correct, appropriate, and undertaken with a view to achieving our absolutely legitimate war goals. And if anybody has any argument with that, I would challenge them to please bring forward the warnings that Israelis got on October 7th when Hamas stormed our fence, slit the throats of our women, raped them, kidnapped our children, our infants, our elderly, and our infirm, and continued to hold many of them in the dungeons of Gaza. So that would be my answer to it, as discomforting as it may or may not be.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, please queue up to the mic. I have a few more for Benjamin, but I'll recognize those who come up in just a minute. Benjamin, before I see some folks coming, but I'd like to ask you, Miriam Institute is supporting the families of the hostages in Israel and in the U.S. Can you talk about the mentality, the attitude that the families have right now while they're waiting on their loved ones to be released?
Yes. So, firstly, I want to credit my colleague Rosita. Rosita is really the power of the organization that has been working with the hostage families. I actually want to go back to your earlier question, Colonel. You said you made mention correctly that 1,200 people had an atrocity launched against them. That's true. There were 1,200 people who were murdered that day. But when you consider the family social rings that surround that, it's of course many more. So when one person is murdered, they are the son of parents, right? They are the brother of a sibling. They are their parents themselves. And so while 1,200 were murdered, the atrocity was launched against many, many, many multiples of that. And just to put that into context, it would roughly equate to 40 9/11s, 40 9/11s, when you prorate Israel's population with the US population. And when you have 40 9/11s, something needs to be done to put out the source of that fire and that terror. So with regard to the hostage families, I'll start by just saying that I've worked with major delegations of generals and ambassadors and former heads of the Mossad and very, very high-level delegates that we've brought to the United States. We've also worked with the family members of hostages, and there is a particular unique burden that eventuates from working with them. It is such a heavy topic. It's such a difficult topic. The people are suffering. Those who have their loved ones in captivity are succumbing to physical ailments, heart disease, malnutrition. Families are falling apart. Marriages are falling apart. Mothers are weeping. Fathers are silent. Couples are estranged. And they feel powerless. They feel powerless, and they feel as though they have no answer. And I'll make a very quick confession. I personally feel that I failed the hostage families, and I don't know that I'll ever be able to remedy that, because one of the things that the Miriam Institute wanted to do was to get, when you have 252 hostages taken captive, that's too large a number to personalize the plight of an individual hostage. And when you have a collective number of 252, the tendency of people is to largely look away from it and see it as too great a task for them to handle as individuals or as individual communities. We therefore devised a program called the Adopt a Hostage campaign that called upon individual Jewish or non-Jewish communities to adopt a hostage family and support them as they went about campaigning for the release of their loved ones. And I failed in that endeavor. I failed because I couldn't move the communities to actually engage in that effort to the degree that I wanted. And I mistakenly made that offer to the hostage families prior to knowing what the result would be. So I just want to be candid. We have our successes, we have our failures. That's one of my failures during this war.
Yeah. It's a tough situation emotionally and intellectually,
Very
morally
much so.
for the families. I want to take a question from over here.
Good evening, Mr. Anthony. My name is Cadet McLaughlin. I was just wondering what the rules of engagement were and how are those rules of engagement relating to the treatment and interactions of the local population?
Thank you very much for the question. Did everybody hear that question? Okay, so I'd like to begin by asking what are the rules of engagement here? And then I'll answer the question.
Well, in the class you sat in this morning, it was very strict, and we were in Somalia and Kosovo. So I was just wondering, since you sat in on that class, maybe you could kind of follow up to how the rules of engagement were with the local population, because not just is it like a regular war, but it's a religious war, and having some bigger feelings about religion and your combatants and the local population. I was just wondering, how were the local people treated, and how when you interacted with the local population, how that went around.
So your question's a really important question. The reason I asked you about your rules of engagement is not to catch you out, far from it. The last that I heard, the US rules of engagement were roughly fire if fired upon. Is that fair? Is that correct?
That's correct, from what you heard today. Yeah.
Yes, fire if fired upon. I had the pleasure of sitting in on Colonel Gray's class. I learned more there in 50 minutes than I did at a semester at Manchester University. You're a great, great educator, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to listen to that class. So one of the things you'll realize if you're ever deployed to a war zone or a conflict zone is that the rules of engagement need to be highly adaptable. There is no single, in my experience, there is no single set of rules of engagement that apply to all dynamics. So, for example, if you are a member right now of the Israel Defense Forces in the current dynamic, imagine that the ceasefire hadn't taken hold, and you were operating on the front line of towns and cities like Jabalia or Zaytun in the north of the Gaza Strip, you are operating under the presumption that anybody in front of you, the area having been cleared of civilians, is an enemy combatant, and your job is to remove that combatant from the battlefield. Okay? But there is a whole array of rules of engagement that the IDF operates by in other conflict areas that are not hot wars, but are absolutely relevant to the nub of your question, namely, how do we interact with people of different religious faiths? How do we interact with people who are hostile towards us? And I think between the lines, you're wondering who we may have a hostile attitude towards as well, right?
Yes, sir.
It's a totally fair question. So I'll give you an example. I spent months of my life operating in the city of Hebron, or Hebron. I think the Americans call it Hebron, right? And Hebron is the burial ground. It's a very holy city to the Jewish people. It's the city in which Abraham purchased a cave for the burial of his wife. Okay, and so it's a very complex area to operate in because unlike Jenin or Ramallah, which are other Palestinian Arab cities in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Hebron is Jewish home next to Palestinian Arab home, next to Jewish home, next to Muslim home. And you're operating there all the time. And one of the weapons that is used, for example, will be a Molotov cocktail. Are you all familiar with a Molotov cocktail? You know what that is? So here's the rule of engagement. If you see somebody running towards you with a Molotov cocktail, okay, you have to engage with them first verbally. These are the rules. Mm-hmm. The first verbal engagement is to say waqif, right, in Arabic. Waqif means stop. If they continue to move toward you, you then say, waqif wala ana batukhak. Stop or I'll shoot. If they continue to move towards you, and what I'm saying is absolutely correct, you are permitted to cock your rifle, to put a bullet in the chamber, to let them know that you're serious when you're asking them to stop. If they continue to move towards you, and they do, this does happen, you are then permitted to fire one round from your M16 or your M4, whatever you're equipped with, 60 degrees in the air, ensuring before you do so that you will hit no person nor any property. If they then continue to move towards you, you are allowed to fire, I believe it was changed, back in my day it was from the waist down, I think it's now the knee down, right? So think about making that shot. And if they then continue towards you, then and only then are you allowed to open fire aiming for the center of mass with the intent to kill. Those are the rules of engagement in the vast majority of the conflict zones in which IDF soldiers are deployed. Because a time without war in Israel mustn't be confused for being a time of peace. We're a very far cry from that at any given moment. And those rules of engagement are a very distant cry without applying any judgment to it, to the rules of engagement of fire if fired upon. Now, why? Why are they so protracted? Firstly, because these are our moral principles manifested as rules of engagement, again, without casting aspersions on anyone else's moral standards. But secondly, we are observed, watched, supervised, interfered with, to a degree that I don't believe any other military is, by international organizations, the United Nations, UNIFIL up in the north of Israel and elsewhere. And so we're very, very deliberate about keeping our soldiers out of trouble. And the final reason that we are pleased to operate by such rules of engagement is that, unlike here, as I've said to you already, IDF soldiers, in the United States military, people want to be soldiers, or airmen, or midshipmen, or whatever it may be, okay? They want to be soldiers, so they select and elect to be soldiers. In Israel, it's the opposite. In Israel, we're drafted at 18, and because of that, within ourselves, we operate in the following manner. We want to negotiate 2 to 3 years of high moral dilemma and return our uppermost priority at the end of that experience to being civilians. Civilians of good conscience who can raise our families, look at ourselves in the mirror and say that in complex situations we did our very best, and those rules of engagement have assisted us in so doing. So I'm sorry that was a bit of a long answer, but I thought it was important to say that.
Great question. You'll find in contingency operations that the U.S. does, very similar pattern of ROE called escalation of force to give every opportunity for the parties to disengage. But as Benjamin says, there is a no penetration line at some point in your authorized use force. Great question.
Sir, I do just want to add one final point. If the Molotov cocktail has left the hand of the person throwing it, no, you're not allowed to open fire. You have to then chase that person down because the Molotov cocktail is the threat, not the individual.
Yeah, that'd be a little different.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Question over here.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for coming. With the bombing of many Iranian regions and the weakness of the Iranian regime before doing so, do you think it is counterintuitive to bomb these regions because it may bring out a rally around the flag effect and therefore strengthen the regime while doing the inverse of Israeli grand strategy?
Great question. My direct answer to that is no. I think that the state of Israel has an absolute duty and a right to prevent nuclear proliferation. And I think that it is doing everything to prevent the continued pursuit of nuclear weapons capabilities in Iran without launching direct strikes against those capabilities, against those programs. Now why is it not doing that? Because that's a diplomatic dance that Israel is engaged with the United States over. When is the time? When is the place? What might be the consequences? So on and so forth. But if you look at regimes around the world, and if you look at Israel's key role in preventing regimes from having nuclear capabilities, I believe you'll come to the same conclusion as I have come to, which is that Israel detonated the Iraqi nuclear weapons program in Osirak in 1981. Over a long enough period of time, that regime fell. Israel also detonated the Syrian nuclear weapons program that was purchased from North Korea. The know-how was purchased from North Korea, right? And we detonated that in 2007 in an operation called Operation Out of the Box. I think it was then renamed Operation Opera in 2007. Across a long enough period of time, as we just saw, that Assad regime in Syria fell. Now, if you look at regimes that have been permitted to acquire nuclear weapons capabilities, you see that no matter the degree of unrest in the given country, those regimes tend to endure, right? Or let me say they endure far too frequently. So I'm thinking there about North Korea, and I'm thinking there also, I will throw Russia into the mix as well with that, okay, the former Soviet Union. So Russia and formerly the Soviet Union, rather. So I think that history shows that actually defanging, to use that word again, regimes of the ultimate deterrent, nuclear weapons capabilities, any effort made in that pursuit does not result in a rallying around the flag. it takes us closer to being freed of these rogue regimes, and it moves us away from the specter of a nuclear strike against Israel. And we definitely have to tackle the Iranian threat. They have launched hundreds of ballistic missiles in a kinetic attack from their sovereign territory to our sovereign territory in the course of this war. That regime needs to be dealt with, and the most important aspect of dealing with it is to prevent it from having a nuclear weapons capability. And finally, they are more vulnerable for the taking now than they have ever been, and I'll explain it in brief form. Their deterrent, Hezbollah, who I spoke about earlier, has been decimated. It's not been destroyed, but it's been decimated. It no longer constitutes the threat to Israel that it once did. Putin has left Syria. He was meddling around in Syria for a very long time, had the S-300 air defense systems there that would have made it much more difficult in terms of our flight path over to Iran. He's no longer there. Hezbollah is no longer in Syria propping up the Assad regime for the same reason as I mentioned a little bit earlier. We have normalization with moderate Sunni states in the region, and I think that it's high time that Israel went forward and taught Iran a lesson.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
We'll take one more question here, because I have a question I want to get to
Sure.
about the future.
Yeah.
Sir.
Sir, I'd like to thank you for coming. I think it's very timely that you come. Yesterday was 500 days since the
Yes.
October 7th massacre.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about the hostages in captivity and specifically about the first phase deal. So as you know, almost half of the hostages that we're bringing home are likely dead. And the people that we're bringing home are mostly women and children in this phase. And in return, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are getting murderers, rapists, and terrorists. So considering the history of prison exchange, and I'm here thinking of Mohammed Daif and Yahya Sinwar, who were both in Israeli prisons and were exchanged and eventually became the architects of the October 7th attack, how do we prevent the thousands of terrorists that we're sending back to Palestine from doing the same thing again in 10, 15 years?
Okay. So it's nice to see you again.
Thank you, sir.
You're a graduate of the ISAP tour.
Yes, sir.
And it's wonderful to see you, and I believe you're graduating this year. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Well,
Hopefully.
I wish you success and safety wherever you go, right? I just want to correct you, because I said I'd be candid with you. Mm-hmm. It's words matter. To me, words matter. So you made mention, this isn't a rebuke, it's a correction. You made mention of the idea that released terrorists are being sent back to Palestine. This conflict is in part about the lack of existence of a Palestinian state.
Yes, sir.
There is not a state of Palestine. It doesn't mean that there never will be. It doesn't mean that there can't be. But I want people to be clear that there is not the state of Palestine, regardless of what's written on any maps. Okay? So in terms of how we prevent them from carrying out terror attacks in the future, I'm going to answer that directly. I don't think that you can. And I think that one of the reasons that the release of these terrorists who have blood on their hands is so painful to us is that we've seen that individuals like Yahya Sinwar are released and make it their business, their profession, their vocation in life to murder Jews. And you cannot prevent all of these terrorists from plying their trade all of the time. Therefore, it's an enormous debate in Israeli society. Now, that doesn't mean that our security forces don't monitor them. It doesn't mean that there aren't certain conditions applied to the release of some, such as them having to be sent to Turkey or to Egypt, some to East Jerusalem, some elsewhere. All of these things exist. Our best efforts will be made, but ultimately, I'm of the view that you cannot prevent it from happening. You cannot prevent people who are dedicated towards the murder of Jews from pursuing that outcome, in my view. It's a very live debate in Israel. It's a debate with very legitimate views on either side of it. But I think that the overarching standard in Israel is that which you're seeing being implemented, namely the redemption of our captives and the pursuit and the preservation of life, and incidentally, even the demand for the return of the remains of our captives, of which there are many. There are many. In 2014, as an example, Hadar Goldin was a young officer in the Israel Defense Forces during Operation Protective Edge. He was killed. His remains were taken into the Gaza Strip, and we are still negotiating for them to be returned to us today. This idea of bringing our remains back to Israel dates back to Joseph's request to have his bones taken into Israel, for those of you who are familiar with the good book. But I do think it's worthy of comment, and I didn't know you were going to ask this question, but I made some notes. I want everybody to understand the difference between our societies. The Palestinian Arab Society and the Israeli society. Now, who do they want back? They want back, and they're getting back, Ahmed Balgouti, who was sentenced to 13 life sentences for crimes against innocent Israelis. They want back Ibrahim and Musa Sarena, two brothers from East Jerusalem who were released after more than 22 years in prison for their involvement in suicide bombings that killed Israelis during the Second Intifada. I'm just going to give two more. They want back Iyad Abu Shakhdam, who was sentenced to 18 life sentences because of his involvement in Hamas attacks that killed dozens of Israelis during the Second Intifada. That's the wave of homicide bombings against innocent Israelis that was perpetrated by Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Those crimes included a suicide bombing that blew up 2 buses in Beersheba, killing 16 Israelis, including a 4-year-old. And they also want back into their society Mohammed Odeh, 52, and Wissam Abbasi, 48. They plotted a suicide bombing at a pool hall near Tel Aviv in 2002 that killed 15 people. Now, I could go on and on because the list is very, very extensive. These are the people that the Palestinian Arabs want in their society. Now, any functioning society would eschew any idea that those people should be brought back into its midst. It is beyond this community saying we want Charles Manson and Ted Bundy and the Zodiac killer to walk among us. Okay, it's indicative of a society that is carrying a very serious moral malady within it. Who does Israel want back? Israel wants back Kfir Bibas, right? That's who Israel wants back, an infant who was taken along with his brother by Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, together with their mother, Shiri Bibas, okay? A young lady, a mother whose 2 infant children, Kfir and Ariel Bibas, were kidnapped by these monsters, Hamas, on October 7th, and we don't know if they're alive or not. To add to the depravity, the father of that family, Yarden, was released during a recent hostage exchange. All he wants is his wife and his children home. That's indicative of 2 very different societies, And to come back to your question, the discomfort that we have is that those who we release today will probably, some of them, commit crimes against us tomorrow, but Israelis cannot live with our infant children and our mothers and our innocent men held in captivity by monsters who want more monsters within their society. We can't live with that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Max. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to address a key issue here to take up on the last 2 questions. And it's this. How do you define victory in war? And the British eminent scholar, Michael Howard, identified victory as this. And he said that he identified 3 factors that lead to decisive wars and a more lasting peace. It seems to me, based on our conversation today, that Israel's doing fairly well at the first one. The second one, that's about the peace process and the ceasefire and whether that can go through. But I think the third one is the hard one. Will Hamas and other jihadist groups accept the verdict of the war and what's been done? And really this gets to the heart of the issue about, is there going to be a Palestinian state? How is that achieved? And so there are, for our audience, two solutions. One solution, the one-state solution, where Israel and Palestine would be fused together in some sort of federation. There's the two-state solution that goes back to the UN finding originally. But you've done some work and some thought and presented to various governmental agencies a third possible solution called the New State Solution. So I want to show the short video that you used, and then I want you to comment about this possible alternative to address really the third factor here.
Okay.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often perceived as an intractable deadlock, marked by decades of failed attempts to broker peace. Why does this conflict persist, considering Israel brokered enduring peace deals with Egypt and Jordan, ending decades of hostility? Historically, two dominant alternatives have been promoted for this region, but both were flawed and met only with failure: the two-state solution. This paradigm proposes an Israeli withdrawal to behind the 1949 armistice line in order to create the space for an independent Palestinian state in the area vacated. But such a plan would dramatically weaken Israel's ability to defend itself by leaving it with a 9-mile waistline, placing its main population centers at a topographical disadvantage which could easily be exploited by terrorists or foreign militaries. This plan would also require the relocation of hundreds of thousands of Israelis currently residing in communities in the West Bank. And the two-state paradigm offers no solution to the urgent challenges emanating from the Gaza Strip, which have implications not only for the state of Israel, but for the Gazan people themselves. The Palestinian state would be divided between Gaza and a landlocked West Bank. Making the two contiguous would bifurcate Israel north from south. The one-state solution. This paradigm proposes that Israel unilaterally annex the West Bank and grant citizenship to all its Arab inhabitants. But this plan would involve imposing Israeli citizenship on Palestinian Arabs and therefore would likely increase antagonism as well as create a negative international response. And the demographic shift would dramatically affect and potentially destroy the character of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. But the significant flaws in both solutions do not mean that the region is doomed to endless cycles of conflict. Neither people should have to accept that as their fate. It's time to talk about the new state solution. By merging the Gaza Strip with a repurposed portion of the Sinai Peninsula, a new, thriving, independent, sovereign, and viable state can be created for all Palestinians. Egypt and Israel could guarantee respect for and defense of the borders of the new state. Israel, willing Arab nations, and the international community could invest in the development of the new Palestinian state and Egypt as the donor state. Technological and logistical support in areas such as water and agriculture could make this desert bloom. The new state's Mediterranean coastline would offer rich opportunities for trade, commerce, and tourism. The new state would affix its own migration policy so that anyone wishing to voluntarily relocate there would receive generous absorption and economic packages, setting them and their families on a pathway toward a far brighter future. Israel would retain defensible borders that would not put it at risk, and would preserve its Jewish and democratic character. The Palestinians would have a state with a single, contiguous territory within stable and recognized borders, with room for population growth, economic prosperity, and national pride. A forced transfer of any population of either peoples would be avoided. Applying new thinking instead of old slogans could add to the legacy of audacious diplomacy between Israel and her Arab neighbors, and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity for all in the region.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
So Benjamin, that isn't a new idea. Actually, you've had this for quite a while. Why do you think this will work where the other two solutions don't?
So this is something that we were asked by the Trump administration to create for President Trump to see in 2016 when he was candidate Trump. And we then advised his negotiating team, who became part of the administration, on this plan at their behest in 2017, 2018, 2019, including in the National Security Council compound, which is in the White House, including in the British Parliament, and including in Jerusalem. I mention all of that because I think that some people imagine that President Donald Trump has just drawn this idea from his sleeve. He hasn't. This was put before him years ago. The constellation of circumstances hadn't yet come about. Now he's working on a derivative of that plan, which is to clear the Gaza Strip of Gazans and to rebuild the Gaza Strip into a thriving enclave on the Mediterranean. I actually believe that that's very viable. I think that one of the primary lessons Israel has learned from October the 7th is that the Gazans and also the Lebanese, Hezbollah, they cannot be allowed to be proximate to our borders. Now, that's an enormous subject in and of itself, but I am not a fan of the Gazans. Okay? I'm not a fan of the Gazans, and therefore I don't want them at our border, because it's from among the Gazans that Hamas is currently recruiting. It's the Gazans who voted for Hamas. It's the Gazans who cheered when our soldiers, dead soldiers, were paraded through their streets on October 7th by their hundreds of thousands. And it's the Gazans who cheered when our innocent hostages were taken into the Gaza Strip by Hamas on October the 7th. So I'm not a fan. And therefore I don't want them proximate to our borders because they've shown what they will do if given half the chance. But if you are a fan of the Gazans, and that's a different opinion, it's not my opinion, believe me when I tell you, you do not want the Gazans inhabiting the Gaza Strip in its current form. It is not inhabitable. It is not inhabitable. And therefore, when President Trump opens up the idea and says, let us see what we can do by redeveloping the Gaza Strip, let us see what we can do by moving Hamas out, including the base from which it will recruit, and it will recruit. I think that he's proposing an eminently sensible plan. I think that it's a plan that can be implemented. I think it may well be a plan whose moment has come and has arrived. And I applaud the President for considering a not brand new idea, but an idea whose moment perhaps hadn't arrived in 2016 and 17, but now very much enjoys the impetus of a need for new ideas, a bold, fresh way of thinking, and I think that it actually can be implemented and can be done. The entire Middle East is on the move, Colonel. The idea that uniquely the people of Gaza want to stay where they are is false, and I'm just going to say two very swift points about it. In other wars, nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with the Palestinian Arabs, there's a 1-2 combination that is always, always drawn upon. The international community implores neighboring and non-neighboring states to absorb the displaced and then applauds them for doing so. So Turkey was implored to absorb displaced Syrians and applauded for doing so, a neighboring state. Germany, the same, a non-neighboring state, and applauded for doing so. Poland was implored to absorb Ukrainians, and a non-neighboring state, Israel, was implored to do the same, and both were applauded for thereafter doing so. Only in the case of the Gazans are we told that anybody who absorbs this displaced population is guilty of committing war crimes. And only in the case of the Gazans are we told that this population, the Gazan population, uniquely wants to stay in the immiseration that it now has around it, which it brought upon itself by electing a genocidal leadership named Hamas. That's a double standard. That's what's called the Israel standard. It's a unique standard applied to Israel. Don't fall for it. And lest anybody thinks, well, the Gazans are recalcitrant because they're under the jackboot of Hamas, if you take polls of Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, where Hamas is not the ruling party, they, if given the chance to vote for Hamas, by overwhelming majority express that they would do so, which is why you don't see elections in the West Bank, because the ruling party, the Palestinian Authority, knows that that would be the end of its tenure. So I believe that there's a time for new thinking. Horrific circumstances call for bold thinking. You know that by way of the Marshall Plan, right? Born out of horrific circumstances, but bold thinking, a promising future, and I would implore people to study what the president is saying, not what the media is saying about what he is saying.
Okay, sounds like a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
I know we have some questions. If you'll stand by afterwards, Mr. Benjamin will stay. I can't leave without asking. So, as a leader throughout my career, I always told my subordinate leaders that every soldier has a sergeant.
Right.
Meaning I need to listen to sergeants for their wisdom and advice. So Sergeant Anthony, what is a piece of advice that you would give these future officers going forward about their military careers?
I would say to anybody within their military careers, your military career should be viewed as your first step into leadership. And there are many, many different ways in which life will call upon you to lead. Some of it will be when you're uniformed, some will be when you're out of uniform. When the time comes that you no longer wear the uniform of your great country, and it will come, you may look for another way of leading, whether that be running for office, whether it be in business development, an employer, a husband, a mother, a father. I think that when it comes to asking people to follow you, ultimately you have to make sure that you've ratcheted up deeds, not words, but deeds. That in a given moment you acted in a given way, that in a given dynamic you led, that in a given challenge you found an appropriate and correct solution. And I believe that by having a record of deeds, not speeches, not commentating, not media comment, people will follow you. And I think absent those deeds, you'll fall into that terrible outcome, which is a leader with no followers is reduced to nothing more than a guy or a girl out for a walk. You need followers, and deeds give you followers, not speeches. So that would be my advice.
Great advice. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for some great insight, some fresh thinking.
Thank you.